Thanks for tuning in. Now, in my grown-up headdress, Childhood and Becoming in Ancient Maya Art, with Zach Lindsey, independent researcher, creative writer, and Maya tour guide with the Maya Research Center. Enjoy!
So hello, everyone. Good evening. Again, my name is Zach Lindsey. I'm with the Maya Exploration Center, and I'm also a board member of the Institute of Maya Studies. I'm going to be talking a little bit about childhood and becoming in the ancient Maya world, mostly focused on art. We'll see a little bit of epigraphy, and we'll also see some archaeology as well as historical research in this. And it's a topic that I'm really excited to talk about, a topic that I'm very interested in. Y'all might have read some of my pieces in the Aztlander where I talk about the concept of cute in art. And this is not necessarily going to be cute because childhood is sometimes cute and sometimes a bit scary for the kids involved. So that cute will be kind of a part of this, but it's not the main focus. Mostly we're going to be talking about a few different things. We're going to see exactly what an archaeology of use looks like. We'll also talk a little bit about epigraphy of use, and specifically in the Maya world. And because this is for the Aztlander, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about who the Maya are. I'm going to assume that folks generally know who the Maya are, but of course they're a group that is focused in southern Mexico and northern Central America. Long occupation in the region, many different phases of Maya civilization and customs. So when we look at the classic era, for example, that doesn't necessarily mean that's how things were in the contact period or how it is today, right? But we'll mostly focus on the classic era, and we'll talk about what stages of childhood there were in the classic era. We'll also talk again a little bit about the contact era and the colonial era versus classic era. And then at the end of the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about why childhood was used in art. It wasn't usually by accident. It wasn't just for fun. And in the case of the ancient Maya, it wasn't really usually to be cute. So again, I mentioned that I have written about cute in Mesoamerica, in Mesoamerican art. And the Maya did not really use that aesthetic very often. What they did use it for tended to be a little bit more for propagandist purpose. We're going to talk about what is known as the War of Position, which was one of the main reasons that childhood appears in ancient art. And we'll focus on Piedras Negras just so that we're not biting off too much. But so we'll kind of zoom in on one site and examine that site. I'll show you some images from other sites as well. And then finally, we'll end. I always think that it is important whenever we're talking about the Maya people to make sure that we're talking about the contemporary Maya people as well, because obviously this culture did not stop existing. And so I will mention a little bit of what childhood looks like in the Maya area today. So there is this concept of the archaeology of childhood, and it hasn't really been studied with, not to say that the field is, underdeveloped, but it is a fairly sparse field, which is really unfortunate. And children represent like a fourth of the population of most ancient societies in our estimates. So when you overlook childhood, you're overlooking a fourth of the population that you're studying, which is a pretty big part of the population. So for me, childhood is really important, and it's important to look at children in the archaeological record. It can help us to establish relationships and family bonds. It can show us relationships with mom, dad, grandma, and grandpa, but also outside of those relationships, it can help us to understand social dynamics between children and other adults who are not part of the family. Also, as children age, they receive more rights within the society in which they live. But on the other hand, some rights come with birth. And so getting an idea of what rights were given at birth versus what things were given later on in life, invested later on in life, that can help us understand the dynamics of some of these social groups and religious cults and military cults and that sort of thing. In the past, archaeologists, when we looked at childhood, it was sort of a very, if we found something weird or chaotic, kids did it, right? And that was the excuse that we gave for not being able to figure out what it meant. And while it is true that I'm sure that plenty of children occasionally impacted the archaeological record in strange ways that we would not expect, breakage patterns, I know my daughter can break things in fascinating ways. In general, there are patterns to the things that we see when it comes to childhood. And I've noticed that some archaeologists don't necessarily know that or have not really considered that. So I do just like to kind of point them out that one of the ways that we can find children in the archaeological record is because children are taught skills. And as children learn skills, they get better at things, obviously. But they also have finite motor skills development at different phases of their lives, right? And so if we find a piece of pottery that is lower skill level and also shows signs of limited motor control, that the potter who was making it had limited motor control, good chance that that pot was made by a child. And that has been investigated not so much in the Maya area, but more in the north, in the southwestern United States, that we do find examples of pottery that were probably learning projects for children. We also see more in the Maya area, we see graffiti. And so there is, of course, the example of what we think was a school that was found in Xunantunich. And I'll show you some of that graffiti in a moment. One thing that has been observed about graffiti that is kind of neat is not all graffiti was made by children, but some of it almost certainly was. And there are examples where we see graffiti getting better as it goes up higher on the wall. And well, what does that mean? It means that the littlest one was trying his best, but maybe he was just scribbling. And then as the next person, the older brother, was doing a little bit better of a job, and then maybe his older sister was doing even better of a job, and as they got taller and taller, the skill level increased, right? So we can see children attempting to learn through graffiti, and that is probably something that we see more commonly in the Maya area than pottery that shows signs of being made by a learner. There are also toys. Toys are a complicated discussion, and I'm sure that y'all have some experience with the wheeled effigy figures, which are sometimes found in graves, sometimes associated with child burials. So they are sometimes called toys, right? And are they toys or not? It's kind of a difficult question to ascertain for certain. I will say a lot of them look to be in pretty good shape to have been toys that were actively used by a child. And one thing that we'll come back to a little bit later when I'm talking about childhood today, but that is worth mentioning now, is that in the contemporary Maya culture, children in smaller communities play with plant material a lot. So there are games involving flowers, games involving sticks. Dolls are made out of gourds, for example, and those obviously don't survive very well. So we don't necessarily find toys because they don't survive in the record. That doesn't mean that they didn't exist. And here are some some examples that I wanted to show. We can see here, these are some of the graffitis that were the graffiti that was found at Xunantunich. And over here this is actually an image from the Palacio Canton. And you can see here that the proportions on his face are not quite right, right? his head, he almost has like a Muppet kind of look here to him. And then also this arm is up a little too high. There are lots of proportional issues in this drawing. And while it is, of course, possible that the person who drew it was an adult who lacked skill with proportion, it's typical of child learners, and we see this in contemporary art as well. And there's been a bunch of studies on the steps that folks go through when they're learning how to make art. It's typical of child learners to make mistakes like this, even some of these very specific mistakes, like this person not really having much of a neck, is something that we do see in child art frequently. So to me, that is, there's really no way of knowing for sure without having the artist in front of us. But to me, it's a pretty good sign that this piece was probably made by a child. And if it was made by a child, it may have been a practice piece. It may have been someone who was learning how to make art, and they were encouraged by a teacher to make this piece, right? And maybe judged afterward for it. So those are examples of places where we might be looking at the actual labor of children in the archaeological record. And of course, children appear in art, but they don't really appear with the quantity we would expect them to see, right? Like I said, studies show that probably about a fourth of ancient populations in general, but a fourth of a healthy ancient population would have been made up of children. And for example, we see there are processions on mochi pottery. And sometimes those processions will include children in slings infants in slings on a woman's back. And sometimes they'll include small figures who seem to be playing instruments, who are surrounded by larger figures. So they might be children who are learning how to play instruments. If children were allowed in a procession, that suggests there probably would have been a lot more than the one or two that actually show up on mochi pottery, right? Again, if we were looking at an accurate reflection of the population breakdown of the society, we would expect to see almost every fourth figure being a child, but that's not usually the case. And in the Maya world, it's also not very common. So sort of the most famous Maya vases featuring children have the jaguar baby on them, right? So mythological children. But Maya vases feature very few real children. Ceramics sometimes do, specifically figurines. So we're going to look at some of the figurines that do feature children. And stone does feature children. And there's, of course, the famous mural at Bonampak, which we'll also mention, that has kids on it. But vases themselves don't really feature too many children that I've come across. That said, again, we do have examples of children that we can use to build some of our understanding of what childhood might have been like in the classic era. And so for an example, one example that I like a lot is K2819, which is this elite woman, to use a video game term, she's dual wielding, right? She's got a monkey in one hand and an infant in the other hand. And so this is one of the cases where we do see, right, an infant. And we'll kind of talk about some of the features of that infant in a moment. Before we talk about that, we do have to, like I said, not everything about childhood is cute. So one of the other sources for information about childhood is, of course, bioarchaeology, bones. And now bones of children don't always survive quite as well because they're not as strong as adult bones. But we do know that these cultures probably had a high infant mortality rate. They also probably had a high childhood mortality rate, right? So we do know that there was that aspect of childhood, that it was a little bit dangerous to be a child, right? And not only that, but children have less agency and power. Even today, of course, they are very commonly, unfortunately, victims of abuse and trafficking and that sort of thing. And in ancient times, they would have fallen victim to human sacrifice as well. There are questions about human sacrifice, right? If the number if the amount of human sacrifice was overblown by the Spaniards, and there's a question now if I've heard some academics propose the idea that the child skeletons in the Chichen Itza cenote were maybe not sacrifices, maybe they were children who died of natural causes and were placed in the cenote, perhaps to send them to the watery underworld. But we do have examples of things like Actun Tunichil Muknal, which in the depths of that cave there is in situ probable infant sacrifice. So it's perhaps not as common as thought, right? The infant sacrifice or child sacrifice, but it does seem like it happened. So it's not something that we should pretend did not happen, right? I have read that we should think of it as, I know many times people think of leaders as very cynical, and the politicians and religious figures who are calling for human sacrifice are oftentimes thought of in a very cynical fashion, and it's hard not to. On the other hand, even from a cynical standpoint, in an area with a high infant mortality rate, the gift of an infant to the gods is really one of the biggest things that an agrarian society can offer, because it is representative of a future labor lost, right? And so even the leaders, although we give them this sort of cynical mentality about child sacrifice, I have the feeling that even leaders and other researchers have the feeling that even leaders probably took child sacrifice very seriously and would not have performed it if they could avoid it, or if they thought they could avoid it. When we look at Maya stuff, one of the reasons that I really like studying Maya culture, of course, is the epigraphy, and epigraphy really helps us to understand childhood and the culture around youth in the ancient world, especially, well, obviously the ancient Maya world. So when we talk about youth, one of the terms that we hear very frequently is chok. And chok is a term that if y'all have even done introductory classes to the glyphs, you may have come across this particular image, right? This is the glyph for chok. And this sign is rare before the Classic era, but as the Classic era goes on, it becomes more and more common. And by the Terminal Classic, it's very, very common, this phrase of chok. Stephen Howson says that he does not believe that that was an accident. Houston says that it's representative of this increased interest in youth and young adulthood that started coming in the late Classic era. One example of this in his idea is the Bonampak mural, which he actually considers to be sort of like a Maya version of the Prince. So the Machiavelli's The Prince. So what it is it's showing what good young leader should be like, and how they should look and how they should behave, and what sort of ceremonies should be going on around them. This term chok means a lot. It's probably literally meaning sprout, but it is more often used to mean youth, young people. It seemingly very frequently means heir, but not always. There are a few examples where it doesn't seem to mean heir. And so it's an important term that we need to be looking for when we're doing studies of youth. And it's one of the terms that we can use to identify heirs in the archaeological record, and also images of young people. Another thing that we see frequently with youth, of course, is firsts, right? So many times firsts are memorialized. The word for first in Mayan is yash. So first is also associated with youth, and we see things like first stone raisings or first bloodletting. The epigraphy allows us to learn not just what positions existed in ancient times in a royal court, but also what those positions were called. And so that's one of the great things about epigraphy, is it really helps us to understand these positions in a way that just viewing art might not. And we can start to learn a little bit about what powers and titles young people could have had in ancient Maya times, just based on epigraphy. The only issue is that many inscriptions are made after the fact. So, for example, Cheluchan Pinich, who is commonly called either Itsam Balam or Gokak Balam, he uses emblem glyphs in portrayals of himself as a child, right? But is he referring to the titles that he actively carried in the present when he was making those inscriptions or having those inscriptions commissioned? Or is he referring to positions he carried at the age he was describing, right? So when we see his emblem glyph, one of the two Yaxchilan emblem glyphs used on Lintel 2, is he saying, I had this emblem glyph at 5 years old, or is he saying, I now have that emblem glyph? And there's some debate about which of those it is. On the other hand, on Stela 3, we have a child who is described as Ishkinahau, and that monument, we think, was commissioned around for the event that it was memorializing, which was a Katun ending. And it does seem like, in that case, Ishkinahau was a title she did carry at 3, right? So that title must have been an inherited one. She also has the word Ak in her name, and Ak is, of course, the Maya word for turtle, which is a name that we see quite frequently at Piedras Negras. To my point before about Cheluchan Pinich, on Lintel 13, he actually is shown being born, right? And on that image, he does not carry any emblem glyphs. So, but by 5, he does have emblem glyphs. So again, this may be to clarify his identity retrospectively, or he may have had to reach a certain age before, probably a very young age, before he was allowed to carry those emblem glyphs. And we also know that Maya folks and Mesoamerican cultures in general, name changes were things that happened as people got older, as they entered new sacred charges and positions. And this is especially true of royalty. And we get to see that in the glyphs because, for example, Kinichionol Ak of Piedras Negras was originally known as Ko. That was his youthful name. And then once he acceded to the throne, he received the name Kinichionol Ak, although he continued to use Ko in certain situations throughout his life. So those youthful names were names that were given to you when you were young, and maybe it was even your first name. But later on in life, you would take on a new name ceremonially. But it was clear that some people continued to refer to you as your youthful name. And another example of this is Gokak Balam of Yaxchilan. He was Cheluchan Pinich. And that's a name, again, that he continued to use in royal artwork, even once he was an adult. Ganbalam of Palenque, this might have just been a title, question mark, Tzitz Bak Wayal, or Bakal Wayal. Again, that might have been a title, or that might have been his pre-accession name. And then we have that girl who I already mentioned, Ishkuntan Ak of Piedras Negras. It really doesn't sound like a name. It sounds like a term of endearment. We only see her listed as Kuntan Ak, but Kuntan is a term of endearment. It's usually used from parents to child. So that may have been, again, her pre-adult name. And what we're seeing is not the name she would have gone by once she had her, well, we'll see, but once she had her coming of age ceremonies, she would have received a new name, right? So using all that information, we can get a few different stages of Maya childhood, and we can start to see what how ancient Maya people would have thought of childhood and development. So childhood is always culturally specific, and there are at least 4 stages of childhood that we see in Maya art. You can see here This is a very young infant. Then we see what we would consider today to be toddlers. Again, that's a culturally loaded term in its own right, but I'll come back to the concept of toddlers, and I will argue that there is a difference in Maya art between infants and toddlers, and a difference in Maya art between toddlers and prepubescent children or older children, right? We do see a few examples of prepubescent children and early postpubescent teens. They're pretty rare, though. And part of the reason for that is because once someone is entering a leadership position, they're sometimes portrayed as adults, even when they would have been children in real life. So like Pakal on the Oval Palace tablet, or a lot of arguments I've seen is that he is about 12 on the Oval Palace tablet, and yet he is proportionally drawn as a full-grown adult, probably because with his entrance into leadership, he was no longer considered to be a child. When we talk about infants, I'm going to start talking about infants. And one of the things that we see through art about infants is that we can start to look at things like clothing, and we can start to look at things like ear spools. So on most ceramic arts, infants are nude. It also looks like the infant on Pier B of Palenque is nude. So this seems to be pretty common. And one example is this infant who's receiving his head binding. Here you can see up at the top, the figure's a little bit eroded, but you can see here the head binding apparatus. Then down here, the child's head, and they're in a crib, or he's in a crib that has some kind of restraint on it. And this was actually fairly common on ancient cribs to see these restraints. So it's also something that we see on cribs from other American cultures, like the Incas, for example. He doesn't appear to have ear spools, although it's pretty hard to tell here because we can't really see his ears because he has this the head binding apparatus tied to him, right? We'll see some other examples in a moment. I also showed at the beginning of this presentation K2819. K2819 was that noblewoman who had an infant in one hand and a monkey in the other hand. That infant has clear long hair that comes down at least to the shoulders. Normally, you see hair like that on children who are between 6 and 1 year old if they're not getting a haircut. So that would suggest 6 months, pardon me, and 1 year old. So that would suggest that that child was anywhere from about 6 months to 1 year old. So not a newborn, but still not very old, right? And that one on 2819, again, was wearing a necklace. We'll come back to jewelry in a moment. K2819 does not seem to have ear spools. It's possible that the hair is covering it, but usually the ear spools are visible even when someone has long hair. So I think that he or she does not have ear spools yet. On the other hand, we have this other image of an infant on 5778, K5778, still nude, but this time does seem to have ear spools, right? And so it's clear that ear spools went in at a pretty young age. The Mexicas pierce the ears every 4 years, specifically during the month of Izcalli, so that meant that the year you were born kind of determined to some extent how old you were when you got your first piercings, right? These ear spools that this child is wearing here were not the size that he or she would wear, would wear later on in life. So the ears would have engaged as they aged. In the case of the Mexicas, they would have engaged during these Izcalli ceremonies. We don't have an equivalent in the Maya world to know if there was a specific ceremony where the gauging would have happened at, though. Now, we're going to look at some of the Ruta Maya ceramics, and we'll see that those are what I would consider to be toddlers. So they're iconographically different than infants. And they all have ear spools, and most of them seem to be wearing clothing. It's sometimes argued that it's a diaper. Whether it is a diaper or not, it is still clothing compared to these infants who are not wearing anything, right? We also see on Bonampak, there's what looks to be an older toddler who is clothed. It doesn't look like she has spools, although there's an older child in the upper left-hand corner of that image who does have spools. And then finally, Piedras Negras, Stela 3. Can't tell about ear spools because her face is too eroded, but she is wearing clothing. So again, she's a 3-year-old at that point. So we know that by the age of 3, it appears that clothing was mandatory for children. So I'm using the word toddlers. I do think there are distinct iconographic differences in the way that infants were portrayed and the way that toddlers were portrayed. So we can divide them into different age categories, right? So these two children are both examples of what I would call toddlers. You can see that their feet are touching the ground. The infants on the other two ceramics, their feet did not touch the ground. This one does have clothes on. Again, it might be a diaper of sorts, although in some contemporary Maya communities, potty training just happens. They just go on the floor for a little bit. That's what I was told by one of my former professors. And then the floor is swept. So it's possible that it is not actually a diaper, that it is just regular clothing by that point. Whether it's a diaper or whether it's clothing, it is clear that it is something that the infants were not wearing. So again, that's why I do think that this is a distinct visual phase in art. And if it's a distinct visual phase, it's probably also a cultural phase as well. And again, based on body proportions on other Maya art, these children are probably about 1 to 2 years old. Again, they do have their ear gauges. They wear a circular shell pendant, and that pendant is also something that another child who I don't have a picture of has that same shell pendant, right? So there are a couple other whistles that also have clothing or also have shell pendants. So it seems like that pendant was somehow important to this particular developmental stage. And we'll see that makes sense with what we know about the contact area as well. Rather than talk about the next two phases one at a time, from there, because again, they are less common in art to see those two distinct phases. When they do appear, it's pretty obvious that one is like a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, like in the examples of Kokak Balam that we'll look at again. Sometimes he's portrayed looking pretty young, and other times he's portrayed looking more like a teenager. But mostly after this infant toddler phase, we start to think more about more the idea of coming of age, and we start to see that most of the figures that we see, most of the childhood figures that we see are involved in coming of age rituals. So after the toddlerhood, after you outgrew the toddlerhood, you would have been facing a series of ceremonies to reach adulthood, things like your first bloodletting, your first kawil, investiture with various religious and military positions, right? And of course, some of those were things that didn't happen until folks were older, but they were things that could happen when you were a child, what we would consider a child today. We have this example of the Kimball vase. This shows proportional adults who are still appear to be learning, right? I think the argument that I've usually heard is that they're learning mathematics, right? This is one piece of evidence that young elites would have gone to schools. Young commoners are less understood, but we do suspect that young elites would have went to schools. The Kimball vase is one piece of evidence. We can use comparative evidence of Mexica cultures to suggest that probably it was also a thing in the Maya world. just how long it takes to learn how to write the glyphs is probably in its own right as proof that they would have gone to school. And then we also see that at Xunantunich, there's what we consider to be a scribal practice area beside the main temple, in a very important location right next to the main temple. So it does raise the question if other small buildings besides temples at other major sites could also be schools, right? This training probably took years, and we can assume that considering the number of Maya cities and the size of different Maya cities and secondary versus primary sites, I suspect there were certain places that were known as good schools and other places that either didn't have schools or didn't have the resources for schools, or were not known particularly for the quality of their schools. If that was the case, noble people from one city may have been sent to other cities to learn, but we don't have any actual iconographic evidence for that. We can look at coming-of-age rituals under colonialism and wonder if some of the things that we're witnessing in the coming-of-age rituals that were happening during the colonial era were also happening during the classic era. Of course, we should not assume under any circumstances that anything that was happening in the colonial era was directly equivalent to something happening in the classic era. But I do think that there are some signs that traditions that started in the classic era, or maybe even before the classic era, continued into the post-classic and colonial era. We don't have a lot of depictions of Maya childhood. There are depictions of Mesoamerican childhood from other regions, but not really so much in the Maya area. Probably De Landa is the best source for us. And he talks about a few different things, which we'll go into. He talks about how boys from 3 to puberty wore a white bead on their head, right? So I was wondering if maybe the shell necklace that those little 1 or 2-year-olds are wearing is something similar to that white bead, right? Girls wore a red shell over their pubic region. That we don't really have any evidence, as far as I know, from the classic era. Toddlers on the Bonampak mural in Piedras Negras, Stela 3 do not wear that style of outfit. But as I did mention, toddlers do wear that specific necklace sometimes, which might be related to the bead, right? Children of Yucatan participated in public and semi-public rituals fairly commonly. Landa tells us that. And so again, if children represented a pretty big amount of the population, then we can assume that they were pretty present in these public and semi-public rituals. And if you have kids, you know that when you go to an event and there are kids there, the kids definitely carve out their own space, right, at those events. So that was probably also true in ancient times. For example, community dances were part of ritual life in the post-contact era. And De Landa tells us that a lot of children were at those events. We also know that dances were part of ritual life in the classic era. And while we don't see children in that art, again, if they were public dances happening, children were probably involved in some way or another. During Yaxchilan, the month of Yaxchilan, De Landa tells us that children received a ceremonial blow on the hands. Unfortunately, De Landa wasn't really interested in investigating these sorts of things as to why, what the cultural significance of this was, right? He tells us that it happened. He had his own reasons for telling us what was happening. And we can't match it to any extant classic iconography. And as far as I know, there's not really a good explanation for what was happening in this ritual. But of course, you know, I might have just missed a reading somewhere. So if you know that sort of thing, feel free to chime in, right? Finally, the post-contact ritual that I'm going to discuss the most is the Kapu Sihil, and that's something Landa described as a bautismo or a baptism, right? Again, Landa wasn't really interested so much in dissecting terms, investigating the meaning behind things. So he tells us that it's a baptism without really maybe, baptism is a very Catholic term, right? And many of the terms that he uses to describe the ceremony, from sins to godparents, these are terms that come to him through Catholicism, and he doesn't really investigate what they might have meant in the context of Maya culture. But we do know, according to De Landa, that the Kaput Sihil happened between 3 and 12 years of age, and it happened before marriage. It's been argued that it was possibly for noble children only, and maybe it was optional, right? So it might not have been a ceremony that everyone participated in. Yet when it did happen, De Landa describes it as having more gravity than a pope crowning an emperor. So it was an important event for people, clearly, but just who was actually participating in it within society, Landa does not really break that out for us. We do know that children were grouped by gender. And once the children are grouped by gender, De Landa focuses on boys. He doesn't really tell us what was happening with the girls at the same time. But the boys entered this corded area with Chak statues at the 4 cardinal directions. And the priests themselves were called, he uses the word Chakes, presumably he Chakob, right? So the priest had some sort of connection to Chak in this ceremony. Boys would scatter corn and incense on a fire, and then the priest would dress them in ceremonial regalia, including a feathered bag and a headdress, and then strips of long cotton, which he refers to as como colas, or like tails, right? So we'll talk about those, or I'll mention those long cotton strips again. After this, the priest would place a white cloth made by the child's mother on the child's head. Landa, again, is not really interested in investigating a lot of these things, so he doesn't tell us whether it was decorated or how it was shaped. He's already said that they have a headdress on, so how the white cloth is affixed to their head, not something he was interested in exploring, unfortunately. And then, again, boys, we don't know if girls were participating in similar rites, but boys would have participated in prayers that included an isopo. Again, this is Landa's term, but what he describes doesn't really sound like an isopo. It sounds almost a little bit like a kawil scepter. I'm not saying it was a kawil scepter. I'm just saying it sounds more like that than an isopo. But it's a scepter with cotton dressing on it, and it has a rattlesnake tail base. And that's made me think a little bit of the snake foot, right? And then the children would have been anointed with water that was prepared with chocolate and flowers. They were given a feathered back rack, and then they let blood. And they were assisted by a priest in letting blood, which is very similar to what we have on Dos Pilas panel 12, where a child lets blood for the first time. Unfortunately, we've lost a ton of the really interesting, for me, the very interesting details up at the top, where we would know if he's wearing some sort of white cloth or if he has any kinds of scepters or that sort of thing. But we can clearly see that he is letting blood, and he's being assisted by a priest here. This priest does not have a Chak mask on his head. It's a water lily serpent mask. So again, we can't say that these are direct equivalencies, but there are clearly similarities in how these rituals were playing out. After that, it said that children were given presents made by their mothers and also an alcoholic beverage. And we can see although this is a zoom in of Dos Pilas panel 12, we do see that there are a mother and a father present. So it seems clear that parents were involved in these ceremonies, not just in the post-contact era, but in the classic era as well. So I did want to focus a little bit on bloodletting because it was an important part of childhood development and an important part of coming of age. Not only does that Kaput Sihil mention bloodletting, but inscriptions mention it fairly commonly, the idea of the Yaxchilan, which is first bloodletting. It is referenced textually from time to time by rulers, but it's rarely depicted. So we do have that example of the Dos Pilas panel 19. And he has a breechcloth on, I think, but there is, again, it's a little bit hard to see, and there is some evidence that it might be a fabric tail, and I've heard it described as a tail. If that's the case, it's similar to the outfits that Delanda was describing. We also have the Bonampak murals where we have young children letting blood. This does not look like a caput sigil, especially because, I have it cropped so that you can see the child here very well. But there are adult women up here practicing bloodletting. It seems like a group of people bloodletting together. So I don't know if this would have been her first bloodletting event. It's possible what she will actually receive here are, because to me, it doesn't look like she has ear spools yet. It's possible that they're just hard to see, or I'm missing them. But to me, it doesn't look like she has them yet. So it's possible that she's going to receive ear spools at this event, or that she's going to receive them pretty soon. To my point earlier about clothing, she's definitely wearing clothing. And her general size is suggestive of a toddler, not an infant, right? So maybe this is her first bloodletting that we're seeing. Maybe not. She doesn't actually have bloodletting paraphernalia. And we can see that this up here does seem to be also a young girl, maybe a prepubescent girl, maybe an early teens. She definitely has an earring, and she looks to be helping the mother give blood. But as far as whether the daughter is going to give blood or not, I don't think there's enough evidence to be sure. And then another example of possible connections to this caput sigil ritual appears on the cross group panels. So I have here a picture of the Temple of the Sun panel, and we can see that this is the young Pinichkan Balam. He is dressed like a young person. There are some indications that what he's wearing are young people's clothing. He has on a pretty unusual cloth headdress here, which I was wondering, again, we don't get enough information in Delanda to know for sure, but that's definitely not the most common type of headdress. That might be similar to, or at least an analog of the description of the cloth headdress given by the mother to young people during the caput sigil. Again, I think that the isopol what he describes as an isopol might be descended from Kawil, if not directly a Kawil type of figurine. So here we have Ganbalam with Kawil. And then he also has this knotted fabric, which comes down behind him and could very well be described as tails. Considering that this is not an outfit that appears on many other inscriptions, it's a little hard to say for sure, but the fact that it is clearly associated with coming of age rituals and the glyphs up here, we can't see the glyphs, apparently I could go on for 3 hours if I want, but I don't want to subject you all to that. So I cut out to the part where I was going to talk about the glyphs, but it is worth saying that there are coming of age rituals happening in the glyphs above his head. They're being described. So I do think that what we're seeing here is some sort of coming of age outfit. And I don't think it's an accident that the knotted fabric does fall behind them in a sort of cotton tail, like the one described by Delanda. On the other hand, he's wearing this rope on the front of him. And this rope is something that we see. There's an unprovenance Usumacinta stela that is devoted to Bolon Yokteku. So that makes this, maybe what we're seeing on here is also an entrance to a military cult, or some sort of role as as a warrior, right? Maybe we're seeing more than one thing at once, because there are a few dates that talk about his childhood in the inscriptions above. So I mentioned before that we don't really see children on elite art. What we see them in ceramics sometimes, but we don't see them very often in inscriptions. We don't see them very often portrayed. The times that we do see them, They're clearly in very important moments in their lives. I think it's safe to say that children are not a common subject of elite art. And in fact, in the early classic era and before the early classic, there really are possibly no images of children that show up in elite art. I've heard one or two arguments for figures that might be dwarves or might be children, but they're certainly not very common. So if that's the case, then why do they appear at all, right? They could have just chosen to never show us children. And I don't think it was to be cute, right? I've mentioned before that cute is one of the things that I've studied extensively. And when I talk about cute, what I mean is the aesthetic of cute. The aesthetic of cute is an aesthetic category used to describe a lot of modern art, but it can also, or well, pardon me, contemporary art, but it can also be applied to the past. And in the case of Maya children, especially elite children, I don't think what we're seeing was meant to be cute. And part of that is the visual iconography that we're seeing, but also the scenarios in which we see the children, right? That moment of the Dos Pilas image of the child bloodletting, clearly not meant to be cute. It's probably meant to be what is known as sublime, the aesthetic category of the sublime, which has to do with awe-inspiring and breathtaking, right? And if you don't have a lot of exposure to Maya art, the first time you see a child giving blood, it's definitely not a cute experience, right? It's definitely like there's a certain tension you feel. And I don't think that was an accident or that the artists didn't expect that to happen. In fact, I think that was part of the purpose. When we talk about childhood in ancient elite art, what I think that we're seeing is propaganda. And what we're seeing is a sort of specific propaganda technique. It's something that was described by Antonio Gramsci. So he talks about the war of position versus the war of maneuver. The war of maneuver is something that happens very quickly. The war of position is something that it plays out over a very long time. And although he uses the terms war, he's really not talking about violence or active warfare. He's more talking about a propaganda war, especially with the war of position. So we see that dominant members of a class fight a propaganda war in order to maintain dominance. And again, the war of position is a very long-term war. So what the war of position aims to do is it aims to make the ruler seem like the best and most natural choice for leadership. We see this very commonly in Maya art, where we see rulers being tied to creation, right? Of course, there's the glyphs at Piedras Negras that talks about the ancestor of the rulers of Piedras Negras who was witness to the act of creation. So that helps to extend the rulership. You might know that Stewart talks about the idea of stonework extending the essence of rulers out of their body into physical space, into new physical spaces, right? So they're spreading out their essence, essentially. Not only were they spreading out their essence through physical space, but they were also doing it through time with images that implied that their ancestors had been at these sacred acts of creation, and sometimes images that placed them at the place of creation themselves. So that image that I showed before of Kinij Balam, he appears to be standing on figures related to creation, right? So again, the goal of this war is to sort of, again, make the ruler seem like the best and most natural choice. And we see this being used very commonly in unstable dynasties. We see it being used in dynasties that were facing difficulties. They were, in some cases, facing increasingly powerful sakaldak, right? And so when we look at what was happening at Yaxchilan, we see that there was a king and his queen, and when the king died, We think that there was another, the oldest son of the king may have taken over, or someone related to the king took over. But he was that son was then expunged from the historical records by the next king, right? So that's Kokak Balam, followed by Yashun Balam, who is commonly known as Bird Jaguar. We know there was a 10-year interregnum between those two people, but we found evidence that there was actually a king in power at that time, and we actually didn't find that evidence at Yaxchilan. We found that evidence at Piedras Negras. So that means that Bird Jaguar's position was an unstable position, and we see him do a lot of things to try to show his legitimacy. And we also see him playing a sort of dangerous game where he's one of, not the first, but one of the first rulers to really show lesser rulers in an almost equal position to him, right? We see them very commonly. We see the Sakaltak very commonly in positions where he's taking captives, and they're also taking captives with him. So he was giving them more political power and more sway within the arts in order to get them to give him some space to be able to rule, despite the fact that he was coming from an unstable dynasty. So I've shown a couple of pictures of kids now and of royal children specifically. And three of those that I showed come from unstable dynasties. So we have Palenque, right? Nowadays we think of Pakal the Great as well. He was the great, so how could his position have been unstable? But of course, he lived in a very difficult political situation. He was not the original heir to Palenque. There was somebody before him who was, not performing the right rituals or whatever. At least that's what the propaganda tells us. And then his mom managed to wrest political power and put her son into office at the age of 12. So that means that Pakal's position to some extent was unstable. And you can imagine there were probably people who did not want him to be in office who were in Palenque, or who disputed his claims to the throne. Now, Khan Balam left for a Pakal the Great lived for a very long time, and his son, Khan Balam, came into power when he was already older. And he himself never had an heir. So not only is he coming into office very late in his life, but it seems as though he was aware by that point of his life that he was probably not going to have an heir. So again, this creates a very unstable situation. And one of the ways that he dealt with that situation was by showing us his childhood and reminding us that he was there for those important rituals. He performed those important rituals. You might not remember, but he was there for them. And here's the proof, right? And he's extending his rights to rule throughout time. He's waging this propaganda war to remind us that he played important roles in these rituals. Yashun Balam, also from Yaxchilan. Again, he was not the original heir, and there's some evidence that he may have killed his own older brother. So once again, his son needed to prove his fitness to rule, and his son did that through many different ways, but one of the ways that he did that was by showing himself as a child participating in important rituals. And so we've already showed an image of him as a 5-year-old, and I mentioned him as a 5-year-old. Here we can see him a little bit older than that. So he's growing up here, but he's still a young person in this image. So again, we're being told that you need to remember that even if you don't remember that I was there, and I am the rightful ruler, and I deserve to be in this position. And so that is one of the reasons that they were portraying their childhood. Finally, we're going to kind of dive a little bit deeper into Piedras Negras. But we have here Yonal Ak, who he did not produce a child for more than 20 years after his marriage. And it was a girl, which is not ideal for a patrilineal system, right? There are examples of women taking political power in Maya societies, but it was pretty rare. And so you can imagine that a woman who needed to take power probably did face a tough road. Again, all three of these sites portray children in stone monumental art, and all three of them are unstable dynasties. So again, I think the reason that we're seeing these children isn't to be cute. It's not for them to talk about how much they love their kids. Maybe that was part of it, but the real reason is because they're trying to prove that they had that right to rule. And so I really wanted to focus a little bit deeper on Piedras Negras. So this is Piedras Negras Stela 3, and you can see this is the mother and this is the daughter. Again, unfortunately, the daughter's pretty eroded, so that kind of impacts our ability to understand certain things about her. But she does seem to have a headdress here. She has a necklace on, she has bracelets, and she has possibly a breechcloth, or again, I've heard it called a diaper as well. I assume by the time that she was 3, she was probably pretty decently potty trained. And again, it seems like, at least in contemporary small town Maya life, potty training often happens incidentally. Now, the mother does have bloodletting gear up in her headdress, but we don't necessarily have proof that the daughter experienced bloodletting in this particular ritual. One thing that I do like to say about this is I've been mentioning how these are not cute images, but there is a little bit of cuteness snuck into here. We have the mother in a very traditional pose, and she looks very serious, right? On the other hand, the daughter is a little bit, she's kind of relaxing on her mom's knee. We can't see the face anymore, but we can imagine that she's looking up at her mom lovingly or admiringly. So there is a little bit of disarming, which is one of the things that we see with the aesthetic of cute, that it kind of disarms you from these very, some of the more scary or sublime aspects of Maya art. So there is a little bit of cute going on here, but I don't think cute was the main purpose of this image. So once again, to talk about this idea, the war of position, and why this little girl was portrayed on this stela, it was not an accident. It wasn't just for the fun of it, right? There was a distinct reason that the traditional style of Maya art was altered to show this girl. And so despite a long reign, Kinich Yonal Ak, he lost important territory for Piedras Negras. And he did not produce an heir until 22 years after the wedding. Now, I've read about anthropologists. I haven't actually experienced this in my time in the Maya world, but I've read anthropologists say that contemporary Maya, if you're married and you don't produce a child, people start to look at you kind of weird, right? It's considered to be a sign that something is not right in your relationship. And so you can imagine that if that was true in ancient times, you were probably getting pretty nervous that your king was not having a child, right? And maybe he did have an heir who died young. We don't know that. There's no evidence of that. But we do know that he didn't produce the heir that is portrayed on this image until 22 years after the wedding, right? So you can imagine there was a lot of stress. Unstable dynasty. That's what the result of this was, especially because the heir, the child, was a girl, not ideal in a patrilineal system. Once again, we do start to see some strong queens at this point, but they're usually people who married into other dynasties, like Lady Six Sky, who married into the Naranjo dynasty, right? She was not queen of Dos Pilas, where she was born. She was queen of Naranjo. So the idea of the only daughter, or the only potential heir being a daughter, was probably making them pretty nervous. So to deal with that, they center the daughter in some very specific ways, not just by including her image, but really the back of Stela 3, in my opinion, is almost entirely about the girl. And that's despite the fact that there are parallelisms that seem to make it about Ishwini Kabahau. So for one, so again, there is this parallelism, right? And so we see here that the first date is the birth of Ishwini Kabahau, the mother. And then the last date over here is the Katun ending that they were celebrating. And there is this sense of parallelism with this. On the other hand, if you draw an X over this image, right, the center of the glyphs doesn't have to do with Ishwini Kabahau. It doesn't have to do with the Katun ending. The center of the image, starting here, is the birth date of Ishuntan Ak, the little girl. So the center of the image here, or the center of the inscription, is actually the little girl's birth. And there's another example of centering the little girl's birth. That's in the clauses of the inscription. So the inscription has 5 major clauses on it. The birth of Ishwinikaba Hao, Ishwinikaba Hao's presentation for marriage, the birth of Ishhuntan A, Ishwinikaba Hao's reception of a gift throne, and then the Katun celebration. 5 in total. And if we look at the middle event, so we've already seen that they make the middle event on the layout of the inscription, the birth of Ishhuntan A. Not only that, but it's also the centered event on the clauses themselves. So if it was just one of those things, I would say that maybe it's a mistake or a coincidence, but the fact that it's both, to me, suggests that that was done intentionally. And one other thing that centers the little girl, or we could say underlining the point, is this sort of conjunction of image and text that we're seeing here. We see the nose and jaw of the blood letters here. They're pointing to C7 and D7, and that's the daughter's name, right? So again, Ish Kuntan A, Ish Pin Ahau, right? So her headdress points up to her daughter's name. All these things taken together, again, one of them might just be a coincidence, but all these things taken together, to me, suggest that really what we're supposed to see on this event, what we're supposed to see when we read this Stela is the little girl, right? And as far as the results of that, unfortunately, it's a little bit disputed whether this was a successful propaganda suite or not. Propaganda does not have to be successful to be the reason that I just described. So it could be a failure and still be an attempt to wage this specific propaganda technique. But in this case, it is disputed. There are these conch shells from burial 5 at Piedras Negras, which name a woman named Ishmataquirtzots. And Mark Pitts argues that Ishmataquirtzots married Yonal Ak in this last-ditch effort to produce a male heir. So even though Yonal Ak was already very old, he tried one more time. He took on a new wife, and he tried desperately to produce a male heir at the end of his life. Unfortunately, the effort was a failure. Now, Catherine Josserin has a different explanation. She says that Ishmataquirtzots was actually a grown-up Huntan Ak. And grammar and comparison suggest it was not a marriage to Yonal Ak. It was a marriage that Yonal Ak witnessed. So if that's the case, you have a father maybe witnessing his daughter's wedding. And that construction is actually very similar to the way the wedding is described on Stela 3, on the sides of Stela 3. So it does kind of seem like there are some parallelisms between that inscription and this inscription. And even logistically, we see some kind of similarities where the father of Yonal Ak was dying already when his son got married, and it was sort of like this last-ditch wedding of his son and his son's wife to make sure that the heirship was intact, right? Now, the other thing about that is ruler 4 comes in less than 5 months later, tops. We don't know exactly when Yonal Ak died, but we do know that this wedding and ruler 4's accession were only 5 months apart. So if Yonal Ak died immediately following the wedding, there were still only 5 months of an interregnum. If he died closer to the period that ruler 4 came into office, even shorter interregnum. We've already seen that when there's instability, there are often interregnums, and we see that at a lot of sites where when there's a dispute over the throne, there's time before the new ruler comes into office. In this case, there really wasn't very much time So to me, that suggests that ruler 4 was not a surprise to the people of Piedras Negras, that they wanted him to be the ruler. And so it's possible, again, that Puntan Ak, the daughter of ruler 3, was married to ruler 4 as a way of making sure that the lineage was intact and that everything looked great on paper for the Ak legacy to continue from the point of creation to today, right? And there's some evidence that ruler 4 was distantly related to ruler 3, but in a royal family, that certainly does not suggest that ruler 4 was not married to ruler 3's daughter, right? Still, again, Yaxchilan doesn't really. She's pretty certain that it's the that Ishmata is the Grownup Puntan Ak, but she doesn't really provide anything but circumstantial evidence, right? We never see a place where Puntan Ak it is said that she is Ishmata Quiltzotz. So we can't really be sure, but I do lean towards Yaxchilan in the debate. And if that was the case, it would mean that they were successful at continuing their lineage. And ruler 4 also portrays himself as a child on one of his inscriptions as a young man. We think it's him as a young man or as a teenager retrospectively. And maybe the reason he did that is because he saw that it was successful when ruler 3 did it. So the reason that I think this is important and the reason that I wanted to share it specifically when we're talking about childhood is because it can apply to other dynasties as well. And we can look at it and say, what we're seeing here may have been the same strategy other dynasties were using when they portrayed children, right? So again, I mentioned ruler 4 might actually be a child on Piedras Negras panel 3. Once again, he needed to show his attendance at these important events, despite not being the direct descendant of ruler 3. And again, if his wife was the direct descendant of ruler 3, then maybe he learned it from her that this was a good strategy to use. Even as late as 10-1-0-0-0, most of the events that we've been talking about are in the 600s or 700s, so like 915 era. Even as late as 10-1-0-0-0 at Ucanal, the dynasty fell pretty shortly after that period, and a child is portrayed. So 10-1-0-0-0 is the last date we have at Ucanal, and that image has a child on it. So again, they may have been trying to show the dynasty's relevance over time and the dynasty's ability to be consistent over time. Unfortunately, they weren't successful, right? There is one image from Yaxchilan, which seems to buck the trends that I've been describing. First of all, the boy is alone, and this is one of very, 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 very few Maya children who appear completely alone. His parents are on other images, but he is alone on this particular image. It's possibly because of the way the art was designed. It's sort of like a triptych, possibly because of cultural differences between the Puk and other Maya areas. But I wouldn't be surprised if we looked at this dynasty with an eye towards instability and discovered that there was some sort of instability or weakness happening behind the scenes in this dynasty as well. The final thing that I'm going to talk about tonight is childhood today in Maya culture. So of course, that was all the classic era and the use of childhood and how it was used in propaganda and what it might have looked like in the classic era. But childhood today looks very different, although there are still some things that may have been the same and lessons that we can take from childhood today and apply to the ancient Maya. So like many indigenous cultures, Maya childhood today is both syncretic and idiosyncratic. And what I mean by that is that there is syncretism between past indigenous, pre-Hispanic indigenous beliefs and colonial beliefs, and how much one individual practices one belief really, really varies, not just by community, but by household. That said, I can tell you for a fact, as someone who, well, my daughter is Latina, but she's not Maya, but she grew up in a small Maya town. And when she played with kids, very frequently the things that they played with were flowers, gourds, and sticks. It honestly kind of makes me a little bit sad that now that we're in Merida, she's only been here for about 6 months and she's already forgotten the names of tons of plants, right? So that knowledge disappears really quickly. But the fact is, children today still play very much with plants. They still play very much with sticks and gourds. Lots of anthropological studies of kids using flowers to make little popping noises, using gourds to make dolls and that kind of thing. On the other hand, today they are sort of inundated by tchotchkes and cheap plastic toys, and that's pushing out that natural play, right? So we are losing some of those forms of play that probably were pre-Hispanic, because kids who were playing with sticks, flowers, and gourds today probably also would have been playing with sticks, flowers, and gourds in ancient times. But now they're starting to lose that. And again, in bigger cities, especially here in Merida, those kind of natural toys have really been completely eliminated from the culture, right? Certain ceremonies, I didn't really mention Hetzmek, and that's because we don't have evidence of the Hetzmek in classic culture. We do have it, of course, when De Landa came to Yucatan, but we don't have any direct evidence of it from before that era, as far as I know. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But in the Hetzmek, infants are shown tools that they'll work with later in life, symbolic tiny versions of those tools. We have found small versions of ceramics, which might be an indication that we're viewing a ceramic object that was used in a Hetzmek, but we don't know that for sure. But as far as Hetzmek today, it is still practiced by some Maya families, but it's once again, very idiosyncratic. So it's possible that one town might practice the Hetzmek and other towns next to them might not practice the Hetzmek. It's possible one neighbor might practice the Hetzmek and another neighbor might not, right? The Caput Sihil, I have not seen any evidence that it is still practiced today, and it seems to have been replaced by something like a quinceañera. But once again, y'all are free to correct me once I'm almost done. So so we can get into some questions in a moment, and again, feel free to correct me if you know differently. Other things that we may or may not see, right? Ancestral language. Ancestral language, the Maya language, especially in a lot of places, Mayan languages are at risk. And here in Yucatan, I can tell you that a lot of kids will use it with their grandparents. They understand it, but they don't like to speak it because they consider it embarrassing to speak. You'll see that kids tend to know certain words. A lot of them will know mis and pek, which is cat and dog. Some of them will know makachi, which is shut up. But more than that, it starts to get very idiosyncratic, where someone might know the language, they might not. They might reply to their grandparents or their parents in Maya, or they might reply to their grandparents or their parents in Spanish, even if they're being spoken to in Maya, right? So again, Maya kids, I would never say that they're not Maya kids, but as far as whether they speak their ancestral language or not, definitely very idiosyncratic. And that's the same with other regional cultural practices, like the Three Stone Hearths, right? Staying in small Maya communities. I've seen many, many kids sit down and help their moms, many young girls sit down and help their moms make tortillas. But not every kid is willing to do that, right? And not every kid is encouraged to do that. And so will those kids lose that trait and just end up having a more Western style stove in 15, 20 years when they get their own place? We'll have to see, right? Same with things like fustanes, right? You can see these little girls this little girl here is dressed in very traditional Yucatan, Fustan, Huipil outfit. And whether someone has one of those or not, again, is idiosyncratic. Most small communities, kids do have them, but I've met plenty of kids who don't have them. Internet has really changed things in these small communities. They've exposed young children to international trends. My daughter, again, my daughter's not Maya, but she grew up for a little bit in a Maya community, and she learned from Maya kids the red light, green light, but not just red light, green light, but specifically the version from the show Squid Game, which, as you all might know, is a very violent show. So I'm not sure how those kids were watching it. Let's hope their older brothers and sisters were telling them about it. But that wave that picked up the internet picked it up, and young children were watching those videos on YouTube, and so they were learning about it, even though they were continuing to practice local indigenous culture, right? Many Maya people today are fans of anime. I've noticed anime is very popular in small Maya communities. A lot of them are users of TikTok. You might have seen that there are some TikTok stars who are of Maya descent. There's Santos Tus, who is maybe the most famous. He has a channel where he talks about Maya and the language, and he tries to teach people the language. And he's headed in the right direction, because I do see a lot of kids in small communities using TikTok on their phones, right? So again, childhood has changed quite a lot, and it's really become very idiosyncratic how much of these ancient beliefs or pre-Hispanic indigenous customs have survived, and how they have changed really, really depends on the individual. Okay, so again, this was a really big topic. I really wanted to just give you a little bit of an overview of some of the ways that we know that childhood looked, some of the things we think that artists were trying to do when they portrayed childhood. Again, it was not accidental to portray kids in art, and in many times artists did not portray children. So trying to figure out why a child might be on an image really is important. And trying to figure out if an image was made by a child is also very important, because it helps to fill in these gaps about our understanding of ancient culture, right? Okay, so again, thank you very much for your time, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with the Aztlander magazine that I absolutely love. I really appreciate the work that is put into it, and I hope that y'all felt that this was either entertaining or interesting, educational, or hopefully both, right? I think, well, it's up to Jim if we have time for questions or not.
I just
Yeah,
have
we have
one
time.
thing I wanted to say.
Mhm.
Is could I add something?
Sure, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. I did my field work, ethnographic field work in British Honduras in the 70s.
Okay.
And this was a community, Yucatec Maya community that were basically refugees originally from the caste war of Yucatan. So they really hadn't become totally Catholic. And I mean, there were cha-chaks and all sorts of traditional ceremonies. And there were men who did ceremonies, all that. And I'm looking at the picture of your childhood today with these kids in these costumes. And when I was in the village, I never ever saw that. Now, when I go back to the Facebook page of Shai Bay, I see this all over the place. And I think it's basically because the Catholic Church, who the local people were fighting with all the time, has kind of won. And I think the Catholic Church encourages this peasantization, this peones kind of a thing going on. And because I saw some pictures of some of the festivals in the village on Facebook, and everybody was dressed, all the kids were dressed like this. But in the entire year and a half that I lived there, and then when I was the director of the archaeology site at Cerros, and so I had lots of the local people from Bay come over and work with me and Friedel. And anyway, I never saw anything like this. And then I'm saying, oh my God, the priests have had their way. Before, because they spoke English, the priests were being constantly barraged by the Maya who were giving them the Bibles of uh, the Mormons and the Book of Mormon, and they're saying, "Well, it says this in the Book of Mormon. Are you out of your mind? Why did?" And then the evangelicals would come through, and they'd want, or Seventh Day Adventists especially would want them to tithe, and then they would say, "Well, now." Why does God need my nickel if he's so powerful? And so these guys were fighting the Catholic Church. And there was a time when uh, the Catholic Church was trying to raise money for the Catholic school, and the local and the guys in the village uh, cordoned off the Catholic Church and put up blankets and then put in little beds, cots, and brought a bus full of prostitutes in from Chetumal to raise money for the priest who was sitting outside drinking wine, drinking himself silly. And so over time, I think the Catholic Church won, and they've made them into looking like little Yucatecan kids under the aegis of the church. But in 1970, it wasn't like that at all. They did not do this. They were just little ruffians, and they would sit underneath the tables and do the whoop 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 for the rain ceremony. It was very traditional. So don't let this dress sway you. This is the result of religion, and one that is not theirs. They were saying to me, they said, why should we become Catholic? What's wrong with our own religion? Anyway, I just wanted to put that in as an aside. You're talking about growing up.
Yeah, and it's a really great point. So y'all, maybe this image is too small to see, but all of these women are wearing crosses, right? And that's an important part of the outfit.
Yeah, I
Every
know,
time
I
you
know.
see, Mhm.
It's Catholicism.
Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah.
you gave a great talk. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. But yeah, it is, and if I could talk forever, it's definitely something that is really important to interrogate. And that is very true that to some extent, a lot of this image is sort of, did you use the word peasantization or something like that, right? Yeah, I definitely think there's some of that going on, right? With these kinds of outfits. As far as cha-cha ceremonies, there are in again, it depends where you go as to whether they're still practiced. There are still some that are practiced in places like Felipe Carrillo Puerto. I really haven't heard of any being practiced around Merida. The closest thing is the Chocolate Museum, where they have that very garish reconstruction of one. But as far as being practiced in the communities today, yeah, I don't think they really are practiced so much in the local communities around this area at least. But in Quintana Roo, certainly it's still practiced in some places.
Yeah, and the kids play a really important role in that because their imitation of the frogs is
Mhm.
which brings the rain. So uh, anyway, they're inculcated very, very early in the game with the cha-chaks at least, and I don't know about the other ceremonies. And they did do Hetzmek too there.
Yeah, great points. Thank you for adding that.
Sure.
Thank you, Ira, for your comments and great work
Do I have something
you
to
did
add?
at Ceros.
Oh,
Uh,
thank you. Thank you.
and we've had, Deborah Walker speak, and I'd like to get a hold of David Friedel, but I've been in contact with him over the years.
I haven't seen him for years now.
Really. Doreen, was that you?
Yes. Yes, I'd like to just mention three things. My husband and I, we took a group of students to stay in a village in the Yucatan about 50 years ago. And at that time, one of the things I'd like to mention is that the girls got up early in the morning with their mothers to make the breakfast for their husband and son. The son was like 5 years old at the time, and they would go out to the fields, the milpas, and under the hot sun, starting at 5 o'clock in the morning, they'd be pulling the stones that keep coming up from the ground away from the vegetables and the corn plants. And they would be doing that all day. And that was what boys mostly were expected to do. The girls got up with their morning, with their mothers in the morning early to make the cereal for the fathers to carry, and they were with their mothers all the time. And we used to bring in groups also to do tours there. And the mother would quickly change her repeal, but pick up the baby, the toddler, and the youngest girl, and they would go accompany with their mother on our bus. But those two had to be with the mother. The son had to be with the father, and that seemed to be the way. Two, I learned about when it didn't rain, that they did have the chalk ceremony, and 4 boys would have to be at the corner of the table and be there all night making frog noises. 3, we were there when a child under 2 died, and the children were very much involved in the burial. The local Haman had to explain to them what to do, and they would be leading with a dog. They had to have a blue milk bottle put in and then the children, it was very sad to see the children pulling the cart with the hearse to the cemetery. I enjoyed the talk very much. I learned a lot, and that's going to make me check out more. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad to hear that. I didn't mention, but Houston's book, I think it's called The Gifted Passage. It's a really good text on youth. Yeah, so in my experience, right, I actually just recently stayed with a very traditional Maya family, and the 18-year-old woman who was still kind of treated like a kid. She's going to be married soon. She did, right? She woke up at 5 a.m. and came out and made the tortillas with her mom and made us breakfast and that sort of thing. So that definitely still does happen. On the other hand, I stayed with a semi-traditional Maya family. The grandmother is very traditional in Felipe Carrillo Puerto a few years back, and I remember the girl in that family would sleep in very late, and she spent all her time on this internet a website called Creepypasta, which was little horror stories for sort of like teenager-oriented horror stories. So again, we do see some of these, like you mentioned, the kids still in some cases do wake up very early, and some of them, and if it's a girl, they stay with their mom, and if it's a boy, they go out with their parents. But values have changed so much, and family dynamics have changed so much that again, we see that sometimes, and then we don't other times. I've read, I haven't actually seen this myself, but I've read there are still communities where as soon as a kid is old enough to wield a machete, they're taken out of school, right? And they're sent to the milpa, right? And I don't know how prevalent that is these days, but it's something that I do suspect still happens in some of the very more isolated communities. Very interesting. I'm definitely would be interested to study more the funeral. Have you written about that at all, or is that recorded anywhere that I could?
We had a video, but it got destroyed. And
Okay.
besides that, there's just fragments of notes here and there, and I always want to put it together, but I have so many projects because there are a lot of, I just told you some of the highlights. There are some really interesting things that happened. And that's, of course, that's 50 years ago. But that's what was part of the story for 50 years ago.
Yeah.
So
thank you, Doreen.
So if you'd like to be in touch with me, my email is deb-stelton.
Sure, let me write it down quick.
Okay.
Or maybe not quick. I thought I had a pencil here. Okay, Deb.
Stelton, Stelton,
okay.
at meximayan.com, MEXIMAYAN.com.
Okay, very good. Sure, yeah, I'd love to send you an email and get some more info. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'd like to ask you some of your sources too.
Yeah, so a lot of this does come from Houston's The Gifted Passage. Others comes from a variety of places. I can send you a full list of sources if you'd like, but Catherine Josterin was a person who talked a lot about what was going on at Stela 3. The Landa's book, of course, was instrumental in getting a better understanding of what the post-contact era looked like.
Landa again.
Mm-hmm.
That's all very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah.
Thank you so very much. That was great.
All right.
Good.
Thank you. And my gosh, Nicholas Helmuth, you're 2 hours late, but I want to put you on hold because we have Sofia Paredes Mare here from La Ruta Maya Foundation in Guatemala City. And Zach showed some excellent photos by Jose de la Parada.
Jorge Pérez de Lara.
Yeah, de Lara.
Jorge Pérez de Lara, sí.
So, I mean, those are in your archive. People could come and visit La Ruta Maya Foundation and see those figurines on display.
Yes, of course. We not only have them on display, but also in the storage room that is open for scholars. I want to be clear about those figurines. La Ruta Maya manages 7 collections that came in already registered as cultural heritage of the nation by the Cultural Property Register of IDAE. That's the Registro de Bienes Culturales. So in most of the figurines that I showed, that I sent you yesterday for Zach, ¿qué tal, Zach? It was a beautiful presentation. Those come from the former Museo del Príncipe Maya that was in Cobán, Alta Verapaz. When they closed doors, the entire collection already registered came to La Fundación La Ruta Maya with the purpose of having it open, not only to the public, but also mostly for scholars. So it is a very interesting collection where we have a lot of molded figurines that are at the same time musical instruments, but all of them portray daily life. So it's very interesting to see women with little pots and carrying baskets and carrying children and carrying even pets, what I would believe are pets, not only just carrying little animals, no? And I have a question for Zach now that I am having the opportunity for this space. In the collection, we have several miniature pots and little vessels. They are not the traditional flasks associated to tobacco. No, they're not like that. They are little pitchers, little jars and little plates, and even very tiny metates, for example. And I always compare, when I go to the communities and walk in the communities, I always compare how children behave in their younger years. And I'm almost sure, because of how, when you hold them, you can more or less tell that they might be toys. It is very peculiar. So I separated that collection inside the collection for easy view, because I would believe it's some kind of toy. In Guatemalan highlands, children are still given machetes since they're very, very young, and girls still play with trastecitos, we say here. Even the Ladino girls, we played trastecitos when we were kids still. So we see some tourists, for example, that get very surprised to see a 5-year-old playing with a machete and with little seeds, ping, 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 no? And they're going to cut themselves. They never cut themselves. There's something in the training of kids that they do not hurt themselves because they start very young.
Yeah.
So I would believe that these little things must be toys.
Yeah, and so I didn't really talk too much about that, but there is an idea about we oftentimes think of play being imaginative play, right? But there are other forms of play. So one of the very common forms of play that we see in indigenous cultures are a form of play that does actually help out the household in some way. As children are learning and playing, what they're doing is a game to them, but it is also something that is somehow benefiting the household or learning important skills that will later benefit the household. And of course, we do see in not the Maya area necessarily, but in other American cultures, again, Andean cultures, we see a lot of miniature usage in Andean cultures, and that usage is almost always associated with children. So the idea that they are devices, toys that were made for children, or children's early attempts at making sculptural art, I think that is definitely a valid hypothesis to operate on. One thing that is unfortunate is because we do have fewer images of childhood, we don't get to see that sort of thing in use. So we can't really be sure, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, it will be a delight to have you in La Ruta Maya when you come to Guatemala, as well as anyone online right now. You are welcome to come to Fundación La Ruta Maya here in Guatemala.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and I definitely hope to come. And I would love to see those the little cups as well, the little ceramic.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you,
Sí.
Sophia. And she's live from Guatemala City. So we've got a conversation going on with Solomon Bacall and Ira Abrams. And could the inclusion of the crucifix jewelry be a subversive allusion to Yaxche, similar to the Crusoe's talking cross?
That one's above my pay grade, but you know, to the earlier point about this style of outfit not really appearing in Belize, I have seen some photos of people wearing huipil and wearing, especially the men's outfits during the Cruzol era. So it is possible that right, it's complicated, but the idea that some folks were wearing this sort of outfit during the Cruzol movement is not necessarily far-fetched. I do know here in Merida, the cross, if the cross was originally associated with that sort of thing, at least here in Merida, the people do view it as more of a Catholic thing, and again, Merida is not always the best. What happens in Merida is not necessarily what's happening anywhere else, right? But at least here in Merida, I do think it is associated with Catholicism. I'm not sure when the cross was added to the outfits, so I can't say, unfortunately.
Hey,
It's a really interesting question, though.
Can you,
Solomon, before you start, Zach, can I ask you to quit the screen sharing so that we
Sure.
can see our questionnaires large? Okay, Solomon, take it away.
yeah, if I may, because I really like the Ira's point about the peasantry, the peasantization, right, of certain Maya communities. If I could offer at least a diasporic Maya perspective, it's something that I'm picking up on and I really want to investigate further, is that there's a lot of, maybe it's not so much traditions, but mentalities amongst various Maya communities, whether it's Yucatan or in the highlands, that their mentalities of that seem to have more humble beginnings. I'm not saying that pre-Columbian Maya didn't have humble populations, but they certainly had extravagance and royal populations as well. We know that. I see some of these mentalities that kind of divide certain demographics amongst Maya communities. I think like with my mother's communities that come from Guatemala that were much more urban, they had a mentality of like get rich or die trying, as opposed to farming the milpa. And there's like urban legends and family stories that it may have, I think that might have, or it's said that it originated with like some royal lineage or something, and we can't really prove that, right? But the difference that you find in like urban Maya culture that still tries to maintain some semblance of pre-Columbian roots is different from the more rural
Right.
communities and mentalities that you find. So I just wanted to point that
No,
out. I agree with
dame, yo escuché demasiado corto en el futuro.
Nicholas, please turn your microphone off right now.
Anyways, I really like that point. But
I just got served my dessert.
There's more to be researched there on my end too. But I did have questions, Zach. There's so much to cover there. I wanted to ask about the shell necklaces and the shell for the little boys and girls. Any possible symbolic connection to the concept of zero and infinity because some shells in Maya numericals correspond to those numbers. And specifically, I'm remembering in Palenque, I can't tell you off the top of my head what Lintel or image it was, but there's a famous image from Palenque of essentially a baby cow wheel emerging from a giant shell, and then there's also corn, like a corn vine that has a face emerging from it. So is there any possible kind of poetic interpretation that the shell linked with children equals like the sprouting of potential or infinite potential, something along those lines?
Zach, you're muted. Unmute.
So the words that was used for a child in ancient Maya culture and classic culture was chalk, which is sprout. So that might have that metaphorical connotation, right, of a young plant. The frustrating thing about Delanda's description of pretty much everything, right, is that he really doesn't interrogate the meanings behind things. He already has his assumption of what these things mean. I mean, with the Caput, he takes the time to tell us that they're the only indigenous culture that has a baptism, right? But clearly what he's trying to say is that they have some sort of Catholic, secret Catholicism has snuck in, right? When in reality, of course, that's not the case. And the ceremony was not really a baptism, not the appropriate word to use, but it's still the word that he uses. And so when he talks about things like the shell covering on the fact that little girls wore this shell covering, he unfortunately doesn't really talk about what it actually meant to people. So that's, I am not sure myself. There might be somebody else in the room who can speak to that. But it is possible that that is a connection. And the idea that children were sort of seen as sprouts does kind of conform to other, right? We have the babies emerging from the gourd on the San Bartolo mural and that sort of thing.
I have a question for Zach. I didn't spend much time with the Lacandones, but this is a toy that was made by the kids
Cool.
based on the missionary or fellowship flights in there. And so they make things like this. And the other thing is, as far as ethnographic analogy goes, have you looked into the Lacandones? Because they're not quite Christian, and they do have, I mean, they're living it's not going all the way back, but they may have maintained more traditions than other people have. And I would be really interested in seeing what childhood was like with them. And one of my students worked with them, James Nations, and he was when I was at SMU, and he set up an ecological reserve thing with the Mexican government. But maybe you ought to check with James Nations and see what, I haven't checked with him in years, but I know for a fact he's did a lot of field work down there. And I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't have some really interesting insights into the nature of childhood there. And then as far as, we're so Yucatec centric because of so many of the ruins in terms of the archaeology. But I mean, the Mopan Maya, who may well have been direct descendants of the people that escaped from Chichen Itza area and then went to Flores Petén and then left Flores when, well, like late 1700s, early 1800s, when the Spanish built the roads through there. And the Mopan were living in like in 1847 were encountered by the the timber people, the British, in remote areas of Belize. So you've got the Mopan, and then you've got the Kekchis who've come over from the from the highlands of Guatemala. So there's a lot more to look at in terms of kids than just what's going on ethnographically with the Yucatec. I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, and it's a great point. I tend to focus more on Yucatan than I should, just because that's where I have spent the most time. Um, what happens a lot of times, like Dr. McGee, who spent time with the Lacandones, he had some research about childhood that he never really published, so it kind of just sat in his notes, right? And I had another professor who did some time with the Lacandones as well, and she was actually the one who told me about the potty training, that at least in the 70s, when she was doing field work. The potty training method was pretty much just give the kids something open, let them figure it out for themselves, and then sweep up when necessary. And that was something that she had never published on. And she even told me that it didn't occur to her when she was doing that research that it was anything. It was so sort of quotidian that it didn't even register as something that she should be reporting on. And her and I, all these years later, were sitting around talking about childhood, and that's when she was like, "I should have published on that. Like, it would have been worth."
Another resource. I don't know if you've looked into it, but I worked for a couple of years with Richard Sorensen at the National Anthropological Film Center, in Washington D.C., and I think they changed the name to the Margaret Mead Film Center. And he focused on childhood, and they have, hundreds of hours from all over the world of children being how they were raised. And, they named it after Margaret Mead because of her raising babies in four cultures and all of that. But um, I think I know Hubert Smith, who worked with the Yucatec, uh, and he made a film for me when I was running the Faces of Culture series. And if you get a chance, I mean, it's not easy to get them, but I did, for the Faces of Culture series, there is something that Hubert put together for me about living in the Yucatec Maya village of Chancom, not Chancom, Chich, I can't remember the name of it. I'm getting too old. Anyway, he did that, and he donated a lot of his film to the National Center. So you might find some, and the whole purpose of it was because we can't write down everything that we don't notice and that we don't see. And yet these films reveal so much of the culture to us. So you might find some really deep stuff there. I'm just saying.
Yeah, I'll absolutely look into that. That sounds great.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you for sharing. I will. That's probably what I'm going to be doing tonight, going through those videos.
Can I make a comment? No.
Hubert lives in Oregon near Grants Pass, and he goes back to the village almost every year. And when they have famines or when things are dry, he brings aid to them. So he stayed in touch with them. So
Cool.
Hubert Smith, you look him up. And if you need his information, I can try and find it for you.
Sure, that'd be great.
Thank you, Ira. And I'm currently taking I'm making arrangements for taking appointments, maybe you could say, for Aztlander presentations next year. And
okay.
sounds like you have a lot to share, even if it was a historical perspective of your work at Cerros. What have you done since Cerros?
Well, I worked with the Niño Fidencio cult in near Monterrey, Nuevo León, and it was a really interesting place. And then when I ran into some troubles in Belize after a ceremony I was involved in went wrong, and it's a long story. I can tell it later on, but I decided to go to Bali, where there was a living ceremonial civilization, where there was a lot of ethnographic analogy for what was going on in Central America, particularly in terms of the cycles of time. And what happened in Bali when the Dutch overthrew them, it was just their religious, the temple ceremonies, the rituals, is what kept the society going, even though there wasn't royalty anymore. So I got very interested in that. And I made a film called The Three Worlds of Bali about the ceremonial civilization of it's the last of the Nagara states, the Hindu Buddhist states, and that was on the Odyssey series on PBS. So I did a few things like that, and then I ended up teaching documentary production uh, in a number of places, and but that's for another day.
You're still not too old to do an Aztlander presentation, and you
All
have a
right.
great speaking voice.
All right. Well, you got to tell me what you want to hear about.
All
Okay.
right, I'll get in touch with you. Sim had asked a question early on. Zach, do you know how the quarter representation of children in classic Maya art compares in any way to the European Middle Ages or Renaissance or in the China or Japan or in China or Japan before the modern era?
I can't tell you too much about China or Japan, but kids are portrayed, especially in Renaissance era art, kids do appear a lot more. And I think that's partially because the goal of that art style, right, was more approaching a realism, right? Whereas with ancient Maya stuff, what we're seeing is more we're seeing what we need to see and what we're supposed to see. We're not necessarily seeing an exact, accurate reflection of reality. We're seeing things as we're supposed to see them, right? And with Renaissance art, there was more of a goal of showcasing reality. So especially in some of the Dutch masters, we see big scenes of multiple people, and there we do see a good number of children, and maybe even still not the actual number of children that there would have been, or maybe maybe we are getting to the point in again, especially Dutch Renaissance work, where you do see a good number of children in those scenes. So I would say that again, part of it is like the purpose of the art. When we're seeing these scenes where a king is telling us, I did this dance, I swear, there's no need to put a child in there, even if there would have been children in there in real life. But if in the Dutch masters, when they were trying to portray a scene that was quotidian or daily, they were trying to portray as many children as they actually saw and as many adults of different ages as they saw. So I definitely think it's more common in European art. But I can't, I'm not sure. I don't really have much of a background in Chinese and Japanese art.
All right, thank you. And Nicholas Helmuth down in Guatemala City, he's got a comment on the Lacandon children.
Yeah, and Nick,
hi.
I just want to say hi, Nick. I haven't seen you in a gazillion years.
Well, I'm in Guatemala. I've been in Guatemala. I'm working around the clock, 10 to 12 hours a day. We're working on a project of wasps that make edible honey. You can even eat the hive. I've eaten it. Our team's out now in Huehuetenango doing the same thing with wasps that make honey. And then in 2 weeks, we have a major project in Yaxchilan, Tikal, and Washington on the palm trees. So I'm always in Guatemala. I'm never anywhere else. I don't travel around the world.
Have
like
you
I used
looked
to.
into the Maya bees in the Yucatan area and the
We had a
black?
whole project on. We had a project on bees 2 years ago, funded by the National Science Foundation. And in front of my house, like when I walk out the door, They're the tiny little bees that are only about 2 millimeters in size, the Meliponia. And then another thing is the wasps that make honey don't sting you. I've held the nest in my hand as I'm eating it, and there are 100 wasps still on the nest. I
But
don't
that's
eat
the
their
Maya
larvae.
bees don't sting either. Yeah.
True, well, but the wasps have stingers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, what I wanted to say to that is, first of all, I'm sorry. I'm in the middle of doing so much since I've donated my 30 years of photography to Dumbarton Oaks. I'm busy preparing documentation for that. And so I've forgotten until I finally signed up. But with respect to the Lacandon, first of all, as I'm sure you know, the Lacandon of today in Chiapas, that's not where they came from. They came from Yucatan and Campeche. I'm sure you're aware of that. Although most local people try to present them as the descendants of Yaxchilan, Palenque, which is just for, you know, it's for making. I respect their desire to earn money, but it's not the truth. They're from Yucatan and Campeche. They came in the 1700s. The original Lacandon, as I'm sure you're aware of, spoke Cholti, and I did a lot of research on that. I did research here in Guatemala City in the Archivo General, and I found a lot of comments on not so much children, but babies. And then I went over to Sevilla for the grant from the National Philosophical Association of Philadelphia, and found all kinds of stuff where they describe that the parents put their baby in a hanging crib or something that was next to the bed, but the child didn't sleep in the bed. It slept in a hanging bed next to the parents' bed, so it wouldn't fall out of the bed. But it was at a height, so when the child wanted milk, it was at the height he could just, shall we say, open the door of his crib and get the milk from mommy and then go back to sleep. And they also, we have a lot of Mayan people working for us here in Guatemala. They live in our office. We have a 6-story building here. So it's a residence and an office. And when you go to the Kikchi villages, really remote areas, you often have to have 4x4 to get there. The children they make little walking things. I don't know whether these are indigenous or not, or whether they're something modern, but they put the child in a little square wooden container so the child can walk holding onto the container and doesn't fall.
Oh, fascinating.
So again, these are more, well, that's more of a child, and the other stuff is more babies. But if you look online for my ethno-historical stuff on the Cholti Lacandon, and also Nicolás de Valenzuela wrote a complete description, Nicolás de Valenzuela, published in Germany. I found it in Spain, and the Germans got very upset that they already knew about it in Germany. I didn't know it was in Germany also. And so they got so mad, they published it quickly to sock me in the face and kick me out the front door, which is fine. That doesn't bother me. But these guys walked right into the Cholti Lacandon houses and describes everything that's in them. So it's like, you know, we always use Bishop Landa, but we must remember that they're, you know, Andres de Avendaño for the Itza, of course, he's well known. Nicolás de Valenzuela is not as well known, but he publishes incredible views of going into Sak Balam. And so anyway, there is a lot of ethno-historical information.
Excellent.
Cool. Yeah, I'll check that out for sure. Yeah, I mean, with Delanda, right, it's mostly the issue is that that's the most comprehensive single descriptions, right? Whereas some other works might mention, they'll go into the house and they'll kind of mention, here's what the mom's doing, and here's what the dad's doing, and here's what the kid's doing, and it's all kind of mixed together. So Delanda is where it is kind of like pooled out and focused on childhood, which is one of the reasons that I tend to rely on it so much. But yeah, there are definitely others who mention it, and I'll definitely check that out as well. The Nicolás de Valenzuela. Thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
And I don't know if I've mentioned it, but for those watching the recording, Alex Krim has mentioned the Kawil emerging from the shell is from the main tablet of the Temple of the Foliated Cross at Palenque. So thank you, Alex.
Yeah, and Palenque has a few images of infants in similar situations, or infants that that appear to have elements of Kawil, right? The Pier B, which I showed a picture of at the beginning of the presentation, also has an infant with a snake foot. So that is a iconography that appears fairly commonly at Palenque.
I think in one of the Copan benches or thrones, the Pautun who uphold it, of course, usually got in, but I think there's 2 examples when they're fairly young.
Okay.
You'd have to look at every Copan bench. I've published a lot of them, and of course, all the Copan projects have published. But again, they're often obviously adults. Usually they're got in or a Pautun relative. But I vaguely remember there may have been a couple of young kids holding it up.
Cool. I'll look into those as well.
Ira, you got a nice comment here. It says, Ira sounds like he's got a lot of badass information. Would be really like to hear more about the cult and the long believed story. Has anybody else got any comments or questions for Zach?
A quick one. What are the likelihoods that we may be confusing some of these children images for dwarf figures like the Alushob and the Guatemalan name is escaping me. I think it's Chumilab is one of the names for, we call them duendes too, and more like syncretic traditions.
Yeah, it's a good point. So it does take a little bit of care. There's actually a figure at Yaxchilan that looks to be a dwarf holding up something. Now it's just the stone, so we can't see what he was holding up. Part of it is proportionalism, right? The length of the limbs in proportion to the rest of their bodies. Part of it is context, right? Again, with children, we only see them with adults, and there are usually sort of iconographic cues that, so with, for example, Stela 3, we know that she's a young child because the dates tell us, but also her body proportions look more like the body proportions that we see on ceramics of children of that age. But also the expression that she's giving her mother is a little bit more of like a tender parent-child relationship. I guess sort of the one where there might be a question is, I showed the image from Yaxchilan, which is just a single, it was part of a triptych that seems to represent the king, the queen, and then their heir. But that heir could, because he's alone, and so the context is a little bit different, that one could possibly be a dwarf. But I do think most of the time, it's pretty clear when someone is a dwarf versus when they're a child. Dwarves are holding mirrors frequently, and usually the context is pretty clear. On some of the panels from Piedras Negras that have children, again, dwarves tend to be a little bit more rotund in shape, and like the younger, the prepubescent, postpubescent teenagers tend to be flaquitos, little thin poles, So that is kind of one thing that gives them away as children versus dwarves. But it's definitely something that you need to be cautious about when you're looking at childhood iconography. And there are some figures where it's a little bit hard to tell, but usually the proportions, I think, make it pretty clear.
All right. Well, thank you, Zach. That was excellent. I just want to say a few of the people that have been with us tonight are going to be future Aztlander presenters. Solomon Pakal himself, I'm not in my notes. I'm not sure if he's chosen the date, but it's in early July, July 7th or the 11th. Solomon Bacall and Mark Elmy, who was with us earlier. He's just completed a walk in and out of trip to El Mirador. He's going to present on September 22nd, the fall equinox, and his program is kind of tied in with an archaeological astronomy angle. And Ira, you were mentioning John Pohl, and John Pohl will be returning to present for the Aztlander on November 10th. So that's our
Good.
future
Yeah,
thing.
I went down with John to the Mixtec area and brought some students, and we filmed his work with the Mixtec codices,
Oh,
using the codices as a roadmap, as true history rather than myth, following the description of a journey by six deer, I think that was who it was, from one site to another site. And linguistically, the people still called places by their native names, like Hill of the Wasp and Hill, Palace of Nine Deer. And anyway, we followed them, and along the way, they discovered new sites that had never been found before, because the description in the codex was a true historical account, and it's absolutely fascinating. And John is right on the tip of amazing things. I've been a fan of his for years.
yeah, I've been in touch a lot with John Carlson, and he's going to present in February. But before then, I'll be releasing an article about his work with the Goryeo Codex. But also, he's working on a project that involves an actual personal artifact from Nine Wind.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the historical Nine Wind.
Huh.
So that's a lot of good stuff coming up.
Yeah.
Well, we're 2 hours and 30 minutes into it. If nobody's got any more comments or questions, I'll end the session. Zach, thank you so much. This is really, I really like the no facial hair look. Oh,
It's because I couldn't get a haircut beforehand, so I figured I should at least shave so I don't look like a hippie.
you look younger, actually. You look younger.
Yeah, and Jim, I just wanted to say that it was an honor to present for the Aztlander, and a little bit nervous because so many great names have presented in these talks. So I'm really glad that y'all enjoyed it, and I definitely had a great time.
Yep, and we'll get a lot of mileage out of the recording. But one thing, you've got a trip coming up with Ed Barnhart's Maya Research Center in August. You got some great sites you're visiting. Can you mention something about that?
Yeah, so I wasn't sure if I should do the same shameless self-promotion, but thanks to Jim for bringing it up. We are going to some sites in August, August 1st to the 8th. We'll be following the Zenith Passage, starting at Tikal. I think we end at Dos Pilas, or site in that area. All focused around Flores. And the main focus of it for me is that we're going to be really focusing heavily on Lady Six Sky, who is somebody that I've studied pretty heavily. So the main focus of the tour is really the war that she was involved in, and her childhood and her alliances and her enemies. And so we're going to a lot of sites that were really important during that era. And it's something I'm really excited about, because it's not just getting to see Tikal and Dos Pilas and Naranjo, which are sites that I imagine that some of you all have seen already. It's not just getting to see them, but it's getting to see them in the context of the life and times of Lady Six Sky. So really doing this deep dive into a famous Maya ruler. I'm really excited to have the chance to do that kind of tour. So I think it'll be, if you've been to Tikal before, great. This is going to be a little bit different than some of the other trips you've taken to Tikal, because our focus is going to be a little bit more of Tikal as the bad guy, right, or as the enemy of Lady Six Sky, rather than Tikal on its own.
Great. Well, thanks for watching this Aztlander presentation, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel. To subscribe to free monthly issues of the Aztlander Magazine of the Americas, contact your host, Jim Reed, at jimreedmaya@gmail.com. Thanks again.